Hello, my name is Kristen Floberg, Senior Planner at the Western Connecticut Council of Governments. I am joined by Senior Project Manager Charles Vidic. This training will review the importance of land use controls to protect riparian buffer zones and improve water quality of Long Island Sound and its tributaries. This course reviews recommended steps forward to meet the mandates of Public Act 21-29. The goal of this presentation is to familiarize you with the environmental and legal reasons that support the development of riparian corridors in Connecticut. This 1 hour training session fulfills your requirement to receive at least one of the 4 hours of training relevant to your role as a planning and zoning commissioner or zoning board of appeals member every 4 years. If your term is longer than 4 years, then you must receive the required training during the term of your service on the commission. So we'll get started on the presentation itself. This course will review what Connecticut municipalities can do to improve water quality of the rivers and tributaries draining into Long Island Sound. We will review the benefits of riparian corridors, the legal foundations for riparian buffers, Connecticut's history with their use, and some of the lessons that we are now gaining widespread attention in Connecticut. Let's now discuss the history of riparian corridor laws and regulations in Connecticut. Riparian corridors provide a wide range of ecosystem services and benefits for residents of the state. The literature supporting the protection of riparian corridors has exploded over the last 30 years, and there's indisputable evidence of the important role that buffer zones play in protecting the state's river water quality. Riparian corridors are often called buffers and are the filter systems for the state's rivers. They also can have a positive impact on the thermal health of rivers when tree canopies are present. Since Connecticut's rivers drain into Long Island Sound, they also play a major role in reducing hypoxic conditions in coastal waters. Indeed, recent research by Princeton University researchers has shown that forested microclimates create cloud cover benefits that in turn maintain the health of our forests. Riparian corridors are also critical migratory pathways for terrestrial and aquatic species. By creating connected, undeveloped space and ecosystem for the region's wildlife can much more easily thrive. The recognition of the importance of protecting riparian buffers has had a long and storied history. Earliest concerns focused on wastewater and industrial effluent that was poisoning rivers and streams. It was not until the 1970s when serious national and statewide awareness emerged on the need to protect water quality. Connecticut's legislators have long recognized keeping septic systems away from rivers, streams, and wetlands. And in 1923, the Connecticut Public Health Code required a 75-foot setback of cesspools from wells. Explicit reference to septic systems came with the 1945 Public Health Code. The 5 Mile River Commission was established in 1971, first such commission in Connecticut. By 1993, there were 10 such commissions in Connecticut. Protection of rivers and streams was facilitated by the 1972 Act concerning inland wetlands and watercourses. By 1988, all 169 municipalities were required to take ownership of that regulatory program. In 2012, the state legislature mandated a reduction in non-point sources of phosphorus in state waters. And once again, in 2021, the state legislature required planning and zoning commissions to reduce hypoxic conditions in Long Island Sound. In that same year, WestCog released a report titled The Case for Riparian Corridor Protections, Zoning Strategies to Reduce Pollution in Inland Waters and Result in Hypoxia of Long Island Sound. We're going to go into more detail on the number of these important water quality laws during this training section. Protection of these buffer zones are also driven by federal, state, and local government regulations. The federal and state governments, however, focus on point source discharges to water resources and do not have direct authority over land use. That is one of the key reasons that the state legislature passed Public Act 21-29, since zoning commissions play a critical role in how and what gets developed within a riparian corridor, especially activities and land uses that generate non-point sources of pollution. So now we're going to discuss the type of development pressures on riparian corridors. Many municipalities have stormwater management plans. However, they do not address non-point sources of pollution. Here you can see a photo of the algae growth in Holt's Ice Pond in Stamford, which is one of the reasons the Mill River is designated as a restoration priority by DEEP. We're going to talk more on that matter later. Over the years, UConn has done some excellent studies of the development trends. This one here is of the 300 feet of the river systems of the state. As you can see from this slide, dark red towns had extensive development in the 300-foot riparian buffer zone, which exceeds 51% of the land area. The most impacted municipalities are along the Connecticut coastline and along I-91, Route 7, and Route 8 corridors. Historically, the dark red towns are ones that have long had higher density development in Connecticut. Western Connecticut, even very recently, has experienced some significant flood damage over the last 35 years as a result of more powerful storms and increased rainfall intensities. Flood damage has been greatest in the most urbanized portions of Western Connecticut, where there is relatively high levels of impervious land cover. Note that the top 5 worst flood insurance losses between 1984 and 2019 are along the Connecticut coastline. These are not only more densely developed, but also at the receiving end of the stormwater discharges from every upgradient municipality in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Failing septic systems is a widespread problem in Connecticut. Part of the problem is that septic systems are allowed in the 100-year floodplain in all but one municipality in Western Connecticut. Establishing greater septic system setbacks from rivers and outside of the 100-year floodplain is a high priority strategy for reducing nutrient enrichment of the Long Island Sound. Of course, the larger problem is that the Connecticut Public Health Code is one of the least protective standards in the Northeast. As you can see in this table here, with the exception of Massachusetts, all of the other New England states, as well as New York and New Jersey, have far more stringent riparian corridor protections with respect to septic system leaching fields than Connecticut. There are riparian buffer actions that zoning commissions can take even without new legislative authority at the state level. For example, zoning commissions can prohibit septic systems in the 100-year floodplain under Section 8-2 LC of the Connecticut General Statutes. That law states a municipality may adopt more stringent restrictions for flood storage and conveyance of water for floodplains that are not tidally influenced. Stamford has taken this approach within its floodplain regulations. It prohibits septic systems in the 100-year floodplain. Stamford's approach is a good technique for addressing the ongoing challenges of leaking septic systems along river corridors. For pre-existing septic systems that are located in the 100-year floodplain, the only solution is to establish septic system clean-out frequencies to extend the life of these systems and therefore reduce pollutant discharges into nearby rivers. So this slide shows that impervious cover, that when it exceeds over 65% of the land in a watershed, the 100-year flood can be expected to occur on an annual basis. So I'll say that again, the 100-year flood can be expected to occur on an annual basis when the impervious surface exceeds 65% of the land area. Impervious surfaces include anything from your street pavement, parking lots, buildings, pools, could even be compacted uh, gravel, grass, anything where the water cannot um, get into the ground quick enough. So, however, we do see impaired water quality when it'll even occur at much lower levels of impervious surfaces. Generally, when the impervious cover exceeds 11% of the drainage basin, the greater the impervious cover, the greater the stream water quality impairment, and the greater the risk of flooding from storms. It is not just climate change that causes more intense flooding. It is our relatively permissive lot coverage and impervious cover standards for residential, commercial, industrial, and all types of development. So building off of that slide, we wanted to give you a status report for the Western Connecticut region. Here is an analysis we completed for the region's Plan of Conservation and Development. The map on the right shows impervious cover by local drainage basin. If you remember from the last slide, when impervious cover exceeds 11% of the 11% drinking water will start to be impaired. Here, this is shown in anything but the two lightest colors. Anything more than that, you will start having impairment to the drinking water. Nearly half of the region falls into this category. So we are starting to tip over to the critical point in the region with more impairment to our drinking water. Areas over 40%, which is the dark purple color that you see in kind of like the downtown Danbury, 84 region, and along many of the areas, many of the municipalities along the coast. Those areas will have flooding at least 3 times a year, if not more, depending on actual impervious coverage. CT Deep has recently developed a statewide plan for protecting 4 river systems and restoring 9 other river systems that are critical to achieve phosphorus reduction strategies in Connecticut. A federal mandate drives these initiatives. As you can see, the Norwalk, Silverman, Saugatuck, and Still Rivers, which are located in the Western Connecticut region, are targeted for restoration. These concerns underscore the benefits of having riparian buffer zones as a tool to restore the health of these important river systems. So now we're going to discuss past legislative efforts that were used to protect riparian corridors. Connecticut has had a long history of protecting its riparian corridors. Early efforts focused on creating river commissions charged with protecting the riparian zones, as well as to address water quality and other natural resource considerations. As you can see, the 5 Mile River Commission, which was established in 1971, was the first one in Connecticut. And that is located in Norwalk and Darien. In addition, 10 other municipalities have initiated riparian corridor protections on their own volition, as we shall see in a later slide. The state of Connecticut has taken a lead role in river management plans as a result of the 1984 law that gave deep authority to develop and designate protected river corridors. While this law has played an important role in the development of watershed management plans, it did not have the authority to address the land use management role played by planning and zoning commissions. River management plans are created out of state policy and do not have land use or zoning controls. So moving on, we're going to move on to the rise of pollutant loadings on states' watercourses. Charles Vidic is going to take over for the remaining part of the presentation.
Thanks, Kristen. And so we can move on to the next slide regard to pollutant loading issues. As you can see in this slide here, nutrient enrichment is an important issue in its relationship to riparian buffers. So nutrient enrichment, according to DEEP, has been identified as the most pressing water quality issue facing the nation. EPA has directed the states to take aggressive action to limit the quantity of phosphorus discharged to surface waters. Again, the DEEP is under a federal compliance order to reduce phosphorus levels in the state. And the state legislature ordered DEEP to develop a phosphorus reduction strategy in 2012, as Kristen mentioned earlier, and it was a response to the mandate that the plan in response to this mandate, the plan was released in 2017. And so now we're going to take a look at what that plan found. And you can go to the next slide. So this is a map of the phosphorus yields across Connecticut that was part of that 2017 plan mandated by the state legislature. And as you can see, with the exception of the dark blue areas shown on the map, which represent low levels of phosphorus yields, that would be, you can see way up in the northeast corner of Connecticut in particular, it's the Natchog River Basin. The rest of the state has very high to very high phosphorus levels, and that's the green colors on the map. And it's very similar to some of the issues that Kristen brought up earlier. As you can see, the green colors follow I-95 as well as I-91, Route 8, a little bit of Route 7, and even over on the eastern side of the state with Interstate 395. That's because of the development associated with those green areas, which is connected to the highway system of Connecticut. So the greater the densities that we have, which are closely connected to the interstate highway system, the more phosphorus yield has been found by the DEEP analysis. So we can go to the next slide. So let's discuss the best practices that exist in New England, as well as a few other items related to that. And you can go to the next slide. First of all, we'll start with a municipal review. And in Connecticut, the two key players in protecting riparian corridors are inland wetland and watercourse agencies and planning and zoning commissions. However, very little attention until recently has been given to the crucial role played by planning and zoning commissions in protecting riparian corridors, or sometimes called buffers. While an inland wetland agency can regulate the upland review area, which is an area that can vary from maybe 25 feet to 300 feet, depending upon the local inland wetland and watercourse regulations, it does not have the power to protect these areas. In contrast, a zoning commission can establish standards for riparian corridors that provide greater protection for this critical riverine ecosystem. So we can go to the next slide and we'll delve deeper into this particular issue. In this one, of course, we're going to be looking at the specific upland review area criteria across the entire state of Connecticut. And while there are a lot of categories, we'll go into some of the specific ones that are most important. It may not be common knowledge that inland wetlands and watercourse agencies across the state have adopted 18 different upland review area criteria beyond the standard one applied to wetlands and watercourses. While most municipalities have established upland review areas for wetlands and watercourses, there's a great deal of variation in the widths and purposes of the upland review area, as you can see in this slide. From up at the top, one town that actually has a open space district, which is connected to their upland review area, to, of course, the two most prominent across Connecticut are the ones at the bottom, with 162 towns having wetland upland review areas and 164 with watercourse upland review areas. But the ones in between, open space district, and the ones at the bottom are a wide range, including, as you can see, public water supply watershed land is another upland review area that 4 municipalities have adopted. So we have a potpourri of approaches, but the ones we're focusing on today are really the two at the bottom, wetlands and watercourses. And we can go to the next slide. Specifically, this slide deals with the upland review of inland wetland and watercourses regulations. And while there is no statutory requirement for an upland review area distance, because of a policy issued in the 1990s, which recommended 100 feet, you can see that 114 out of the 169 towns, and of course, one town has its, both Groton City and Borough have separate ones. So there's really 170, not 169 wetland agencies, even though there's only 169 towns. 100 feet is the most common one, but we go down to, at one end, 5 towns that have 0, and at the other end, we have several 200 that have 200 or more. At 200 feet, you have 9 towns doing it, and at 300 feet, we have 1 town that does it. And there is actually 1 town along the coast that has one that varies by the conditions established by actually the court system in Connecticut by some oddity of chance. So basically, we have 21 municipalities with less restrict review areas than the 100 feet, and 29 that have more restrictive standards. And this is, of course, a artifact of the fact that the state of Connecticut does not have, like other New England states, specific riparian quarter buffer distances, which govern across the board. So we can go on to the next slide. So this slide shows the range of upland review areas for watercourses in Connecticut. As you can see, the 12 of the region's municipalities in Western Connecticut have a 100-foot upland review area. However, Greenwich, Reading, and New Fairfield have the more stringent review areas than other municipalities in Western Connecticut. And at the state level, the most stringent approaches can be found in the Litchfield Hills region, as well as the municipalities of Bloomfield, Hamden, East Lyme, Killingly, West Haven, East Hartford, Hamden, and Granby. And those would be the darkest blue colors that go from 200 to 300 feet. So what we have is, although on a statutory level, all the state wetland programs should be identical, in reality, they are not. And this represents both an opportunity for bringing and applying science-based strategies to the protection of our river systems, which is one of the purposes of our presentation. So we can go to the next slide. We looked here in table 3 from one of the studies that we did on riparian quarters, the setback standards that are being used. And as you can see, there were different reasons where municipalities have adopted setback standards for rivers or riparian buffer areas. You know, there's the ecological reasons, the flood storage reasons, and specific standards that have been one-off approaches for things such as keeping parking lots away from rivers, cemeteries, keeping them away from rivers, and obviously timber management and excavation activities, which are very site-specific. So what we have here is really a potpourri of approaches. It's almost like a scenario where everyone is trying to do the right thing, but not looking at a systems approach. And we will get into that as we go forward. So most comprehensive approaches are those found in municipalities that have focused on maintaining flood storage, and there's 9 towns that have done that, and ecological planning, which is 5 towns that have taken that approach. So what we lack today is a comprehensive and rigorous set of science-based standards for riparian buffers in Connecticut. So this is still a work in progress, but it is one of the reasons why Kristen and I have put this together to assist municipalities and other organizations with understanding the broader science-based perspective on riparian buffer protections. So we can go to the next slide. This is a continuation of the previous slide, and it shows the protection for riparian buffers based on setbacks alone, which turns out to be the most popular. As you can see, 30 municipalities have taken a riparian setback standard. For example, 2 towns that do that would be Ridgefield, Connecticut, as well as Wallingford. On the average of all of those 30 towns for their setback is 109 feet. Call it 100 for easy math here. So you can see that at least a large number of municipalities in Connecticut have understood the importance of just the principle of setback alone. It's instructive to note that five other New England states have established far more extensive riparian corridor standards than Connecticut, reflecting their concerns with the increasing intensity of stormwater runoff that has resulted in greater flooding and deterioration of water quality. Details of these other state approaches to riparian corridor protections can be found in our final report available on the WestCog website, and I will show you a summary of these other state approaches shortly in our presentation. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. And we can go to the next slide. So as a continuation of looking at the practices in Connecticut that exist today, there are 2 types that have been most frequently used. And one is the focus on flood management issues, and those would be the ones that you see in the red color. And then you also have river systems that have received a great deal of riparian zoning controls, including the Farmington, Salmon, and 8 Mile river systems. These 3 systems have been designated wild and scenic rivers, a status that requires compliance with federal laws governing the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. That law is designed to protect rivers with exceptional natural, cultural, and recreational value. Now, while we do have towns that have used that law to establish very robust standards, as I mentioned earlier, 30 of the standards that we have across Connecticut are based upon the setback standard alone. So it's important to understand that while there are different strategies that have been emerging from the past, which are really one-off strategies, the science that's emerged over the last 25, 30 years has made it very clear that the 100-foot setback, and in fact, even more than that, is very valuable for the protection of water quality. And we'll go to the next slide to show how some of our other states in New England have addressed this issue. This is a very important slide to establish some parity with what is going on in the Northeast compared to Connecticut. The key to this table is that the other New England states have generally set riparian corridor setbacks that consider stream size, whether measured by the size of the watershed it serves, the width of the stream channel, or whether it is a first, second, or third order river system. A first order river system refers to the smallest stream in a watershed with no tributaries feeding into it. A second order river is formed when the first order streams meet, meaning it only receives tributaries from the first order streams. A third order river is formed by 2 second order rivers merging. And this same merging process applies to fourth order and higher order river systems. So the idea behind that is that the buffers that may be required on a first order stream may not be the same need for a second order stream. And that's an approach that's been taken in Vermont. And you'll see the setback in Vermont is 50 feet for a stream, and it's 100 feet for a river setback. It is not that that is the only approach to riparian buffer protections, but it's one based on, and you can put your seatbelts on for this, the concept of fluvial geomorphology, which means that basically rivers have shapes and sizes and widths that is dependent upon the geology in the slopes and the terrain and the soil conditions in which any of those water systems may exist. And so acknowledging the difference in setbacks has a lot to do with the underlying surficial geology and the fluvial geomorphology of any given area. So why is a river classification system important? The scope of municipal efforts to protect riparian buffers depend on the pollutant loadings contributed by each stream classification, as well as by the degree of development that already exists within the buffer zones of each stream classification in your town or my town. It's important to recognize that the first order streams, including their headwaters, are some of the most vulnerable segments of the state's entire riverine system. Developments near to first order streams can have outsized impacts on pollutant loadings. That's basically the headwater seep areas that then through penetrating from the groundwater into a surface water connection are the parts of our system which are perhaps the most vulnerable to contamination. So Connecticut does not have a statewide riparian corridor setback standard as exists throughout the rest of New England, and we've mentioned earlier, nor has Connecticut developed a classification system for its river systems based on the relative pollutant loadings associated with the first, second, third, or fourth order streams and rivers. The progressive riparian buffer approaches taken elsewhere in New England is one of the reasons, of course, that we're offering this training. There's much to learn from the experiences of our neighboring states. And I would say, particularly from what has been developed in Vermont, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, which are perhaps some of the most progressive that we have with the recognizing the importance that these systems have, the riverine systems, in not only protecting Long Island Sound, but also in protecting our drinking water systems. You can go to the next slide. So now we'll talk about the benefits of forested riparian corridors. Some specifics that do matter. And the benefits of forested riparian corridors can be seen in this table. And you'll see that the width of a riparian corridor has a direct bearing on its pollutant attenuation value. In this particular formative study that was done in 1995, a distance of 93 feet, you'll see that on the last row, provided the best reduction in sediment loads, as well as significant reductions in nitrogen and phosphorus. As you can see, nitrogen was reduced by 80.1%, sediment by 97.4%, and phosphorus by 77.2%. So 93, 100, that's only 7-foot difference, but essentially it's one of the confirming variables of why at least 100 feet has a very significant impact on reducing nutrient enrichment of not only our river systems, but of Long Island Sound. It's important to recognize that the other variables, including the slope of the buffer zone, soil types, and depth to groundwater, can also influence the pollutant attenuation values of riparian buffers. One of the ongoing challenges of anyone responsible for preparing a riparian buffer zone regulation is the need to balance the ease of administering the regulations with the complex set of variables that influence the appropriate width of the buffer zone based on in situ factors. In this regard, it is clear from the experiences across all New England that precise boundaries for riparian buffers work best, and also because they're the most administratively easy to administer, which is a critical variable in why these programs that exist in the rest of New England have been very successful. We can go to the next slide. Now we're going to take a close look at another aspect of the riparian buffer issue, and this has to do with tree canopies. As we saw in the last slide, tree canopies, if you recall, actually were very valuable when you had a forest rather than grass as the overall primary coverage of the buffer zone. And what we've done here, thanks to Nick Trapka, the senior data scientist for WestCog, we've gone through the entire river systems of our 18 municipalities and identified the 100-foot riparian buffer zone for 31 major rivers and streams and all their upstream tributaries. And you'll see from the slide on the right that the green color is the buffer zone, what 100 feet looks like on this illustrative image, and the red, the blue is the stream channel itself. Now at the bottom, we distinguished here between the actual stream and not the buffer zone itself, but the canopy that's around it. So you can see in this illustration on the bottom right that at least on that little jog to the left, there's a kind of a patchy area where that particular stream length is not 100% covered with green, which would mean it has a tree canopy. So having done this analysis, and you'll see it shortly in another slide, we have been able to identify for every river and stream in Western Connecticut, whether they have a robust level of protection, which would be in the case of our 18 municipalities, Reading and Weston, 76% of all the rivers and streams in those municipalities are covered by a tree canopy, which is remarkably great. But it is not limited simply to rural areas, or in the case of Reading, where we have 87% of the town is in a public water supply watershed. We can understand that they would have higher standards of performance on canopy protection, but take a look at Stamford. 55% of all of the rivers and streams in Stamford, in a very urbanized area, have a tree canopy protection. And I would say that's remarkable. And I'm sure Stamford is even working to improve on that, knowing the progressive approach that municipality has taken on so many sustainability issues. So this gives us a snapshot of where we stand. And at the best, we want to do is improve on it. At the worst, we want to at least maintain the current conditions of canopy protection, because that canopy protects not only from the discharges of pollutants, but it attenuates the impacts of intense stormwater simply by having a canopy, not to mention the thermal benefits that tree canopies provide for the river as well as for the buffer zone. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, here is the logistical challenge of protecting the region of riparian buffers, if we may say so. That big arrow is just to show that the arrow beginning on the right side is just showing the blow up of Brookfield as a result of just being able to enlarge it so you can get the very specifics of what we've been doing, looking at all of our 18 municipalities. And in the blow up, you'll see that when a river looks green, it's because the tree canopy is essentially covering both sides of that river. But there are places, if you look closely with your binoculars on this, you'll see that there are portions in the town which are actually blue, which means that there are areas where tree canopy does not exist. And of course, our challenge is to show you that picture on the right. We'd have to do it in a big room where you could really see things. But since this is a a Zoom presentation, you get the close-up on the left that shows you the level of specificity that we went into to understand where our riparian buffers are, one, and two, the degree to which they're protected by forest canopies. So let's move on to the next slide. We've talked quite a bit about water quality issues. So riparian corridors obviously have many functions, and water quality is obviously one of the most important in establishing a buffer zone. Even if Public Act 2129 emphasizes water quality considerations above others, it's not the only reason to have a riparian buffer or corridor. As you can see in this table that summarizes work done in the Chesapeake Bay, and the greater Chesapeake Bay goes in Maryland, but it goes all the way up to southern portions of New York State. Wildlife habitat protections are important as part of this, and they can vary anywhere from 40 to 275 feet, depending upon the species of concern. So the actual purpose of a riparian buffer is really dependent upon the purpose that a municipality has in protecting for water quality, which we've talked about extensively already, but wildlife habitat, flood mitigation, temperature moderation, which has to do with issues of tree canopy that creates an overstory over rivers and streams, even bank stabilization and an aquatic food web. So there's a whole panoply of reasons to have riparian buffers, but one of the drivers is clearly in Connecticut and throughout the United States is water quality. So the decision of which standard to apply must consider the consequences of the proposed restrictions on the property owners affected. It must also take into consideration the built environment and the limitations that may exist in areas where development has already impacted the riparian corridor. We're not dealing with tabula rasa, the expression meaning a clean slate where nothing has ever happened and all the trees are where they should be and there's no pollution. We have to deal with, in some cases, as Kristen mentioned earlier, some things are a project in restoration and others are a project in protection of what is in very pristine condition today. So we can go to the next slide. Now, one of my favorite subjects, the role of navigable waters, and how do navigable waters relate to this topic? So we can go to the next slide. Well, Public Act 2129 explicitly holds all municipalities that are on or contiguous to a navigable water draining into Long Island Sound to be responsible for protecting the ecosystem and habitat of Long Island Sound. The specific concern is the reduction of hypoxia, which is the depletion of oxygen in the sound, as well as pathogens, toxic contaminants, and floatable debris. The section 22A93 of the Connecticut General Statutes, which is referenced in this slide at the bottom, defines coastal resources to mean the coastal waters of the state, their natural resources, related marine and wildlife habitat, and adjacent shorelands, both developed and undeveloped, that together form an integrated terrestrial and estuarine ecosystem. So it's important to remember that navigable waters are the link between your town and Long Island Sound. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail on that in the next slide. So does your municipality discharge pollutants in navigable waters draining to Long Island Sound? So that is the question. The answer, based on the previous phosphorus discharge levels across Connecticut that Kristen presented, is probably yes. As long as there is an outlet to a river, an outlet to a pond or lake, or even to a detention pond, then the water is discharging and will eventually go into Long Island Sound. There could be exceptions to that. If you have a retention pond, that may not be, because the principle of retention is that it stays where it is and it goes into the ground. But with that exception, really, we're dealing in a state in which all of the waters of this state end up in Long Island Sound. In 2020, the EPA ruled that tributaries of navigable waters that are hydrologically connected to downstream river systems and are the cause of pollution of the waters of the United States are subject to EPA Clean Water Act rules. The decision is based on the 2006 United States Supreme Court decision known as the Rapanos case, which is Rapanos versus the United States, issued in 2006. It's a very key, important document which really establishes the nexus between navigable waters, hydrology, and discharges into Long Island Sound. So it's instructive to note that due to recent federal appeals decision, EPA has been ordered to strengthen its regulations governing navigable waters to address intermittent streams as well as hydrologic connections that are based on groundwater, not just surface water, because actually that is one of the limitations of the Rapanos case. It did not recognize or understand the science of the hydrology. In other words, the groundwater seeps that turn into rivers were essentially ignored by that 2006 Supreme Court decision, which is now one of the reasons why the appeals court recommended it be addressed. So regardless of any changes that may be made in the future, it is clear all of the state's 169 municipalities have river systems that drain into Long Island Sound, with the exceptions that I mentioned. So now we'll go into a very important part of this, which is the alternative zoning strategies and, of course, our summary. So let's start with the three strategies that we have listed here: the watershed management protections, the riparian corridor protections, and the low impact development strategies. So these three strategies all comply with Public Act 2129 in one way or another. Public Act 2129 did not explicitly identify the range of zoning strategies that could be applied to reduce phosphorus and nitrogen and other pollutants draining into the Sound. Why have we focused on riparian corridors as a key strategy? Well, if you want a perspective on that, as we discussed earlier, buffer zones play the most significant pollutant attenuation role if we wish to protect the water quality of rivers draining into Long Island Sound. And mind you, some of those rivers not only drain into Long Island Sound, but some of those rivers are tributaries, public water supply reservoirs. And for that reason, not only have a outsized impact on the Sound, but have an impact on the water you and I drink. So let's take a moment to go over two other strategies supporting the mandate of 2129. Low impact development and watershed wide standards for public water supply watersheds and other water quality restoration areas in the state are important and should not be dismissed, despite the fact that they have a slightly different perspective. Low impact development is not a substitute for riparian buffer regulations, since their purpose is project specific and may have no proximal relationship to a nearby river system. Low impact development regulations, also called LID regulations, aim to reduce stormwater discharges, reduce impervious cover, and increase on-site detention of stormwater. In Connecticut, there are 84 municipalities that have LID referenced in their zoning regulations, but it's important to understand only 26 have defined the term, and even less, 13 require no net increase in stormwater from new development. So clearly there's room for improvement, and much of this is being driven by the MS4 program, which is a municipal separate storm sewer system, which is governing a large number of municipalities in Connecticut that have directly connected impervious areas, which are basically areas that directly discharge right into rivers and streams without buffers, without protections, without catch basins. And so these are low-hanging fruit opportunities. In contrast, let's talk about the watershed-based regulations, which are established on a water basin-wide standard in a number of municipalities. They look at a number of things, and one of them, of course, is impervious cover. And also, watershed-based regulations look at land use compatibility issues. They look at chemical management issues. So the approach using a watershed management approach is very significant in terms of upgradient areas to surface water reservoirs. Connecticut has 63 municipalities with zoning regulations designed to protect public water supply watersheds, but only 10 have done so through an overlay zoning strategy. And the reason that's important is because that's the most comprehensive approach to the protection of a watershed when it's watershed based. A watershed does not line up with the zoning district unless you create an overlay zone that specifically lines it up with that watershed basin. And that is why it is the most sophisticated approach, but it is looking at things at a slightly larger level than the riparian buffer zone standard. So it's complementary in its approach. So it is not inconsistent with, it is just a larger scale perspective on water quality protection that goes beyond the 100-foot buffer to the entire watershed itself that contributes water either into the sound, or it may actually contribute it for drinking water purposes. So we'll go to the next slide. So this focuses on the 3 strategies for restoring and for protecting riparian buffer zones. It's basically a strategy that's needed in many urban and suburban municipalities that have already had significant or a certain amount of development within the riparian buffer. And then the question is, what can you do? There is no one-size-fits-all approach to riparian buffer protections. Urban areas are faced with different challenges than rural areas. However, this table is intended to provide a menu of land use controls that can be applied with the incentive approach most relevant to urban areas, and the overlay zone and simple setback approaches better suited to suburban and rural areas. This table addresses 5 principles that influence the integrity of river systems, including chemical management for 1, setback standards for 2, land cover for 3, ecosystem services and urban area incentives for riparian corridors is another example. So these 5 principles are crosswalked in this table to the 3 riparian buffer strategies, which is incentive zoning, which is has a real value actually anywhere, but particularly urban areas, the overlay zoning, and then the very simple setback-based zoning concept. So the approach that's taken will depend on the resources and level of effort any given municipality wishes to invest in the protection of their rivers and streams. And the subcategories that we have here on land cover principles, for example, the 3rd category down, maximum lot cover obviously has a role to play based on what Kristen said with impervious cover standards. And of course, limits on the size of accessory structures that may be put in a riparian buffer unless they may be exempted because they're marine related. For example, a boathouse that might be put there. But the whole idea here is to minimize those within the context of what Kristen mentioned earlier. When we get to levels of impervious cover which exceed 11%, we begin to see impairment. But when we get above 20, 30%, then we have some significant not only water quality issues, but even flooding issues that we really need to be paying attention to, especially given the changing climate that we're facing here in Connecticut and across the world. So, and of course, if we look at the urban area incentives at the bottom, density incentives for tree planting, impervious surfaces is an example. And some of our towns are actually doing things like that, or simplified approval for buffer creation, incentives for buffer easements. So there are a range of strategies. Some directly fall within zoning, and some of them may actually be outside of that, such as the incentives for buffer easements. But the point here is each municipality needs to address it customized to their community based on the slides that you saw earlier, based on the amount of impervious cover that exists already, and the amount of tree canopy or lack thereof. So let's go to the next slide, which will close this out. There are 4 takeaways from this presentation. First, the scientific evidence over the last 30 years clearly points to the ecological importance of riparian buffers to attenuate pollution. Second, 3 laws require zoning commissions to address water quality and quantity issues, and they come from Public Act 2129 being the most explicit, but of course the flood law of Public Act 04-144, which gave greater authority to zoning commissions in terms of flood management, is a very important one. And of course, Public Act 85-279, which is the law that says every zoning commission must consider the protection of existing and potential ground and surface waters. And while we didn't talk about that in detail, it is related to the watershed management points that we've mentioned earlier. The third point is the federal Supreme Court has ruled navigable waters that are hydrologically connected to downstream water bodies establish a nexus of responsibility for any pollutants that may be discharged into those waters by upstream polluters. So that's a critical compliance concern. And fourth, zoning commissions are charged with implementing environmental protection requirements of the state and are subject to public trust remedies if they can be proven to unreasonably have polluted water or other natural resources. And that has to do with the equitable relief category at the bottom, Public Act 7196, which is the public trust remedy that you may not be familiar with, but can occur as a result of interventions by interested parties that are interested in protecting the public trust. In this case, it would be drinking water, but the public trust applies to many other ecological concerns. So the evidence for the need of the riparian corridor protections based on these 4 principles or takeaways is quite strong. So what is stopping most zoning commissions from taking action? Perhaps the greatest obstacle is the lack of clear information and educational materials to assist in the development of riparian buffer or riparian corridor conscious zoning regulations. So we hope this training modules help to address this deficiency to some extent. And now we'll go to the final slide just for more information. So for those interested in learning more about this topic, you can find our report on the riparian corridor protections on the WestCog website under the drop-down menu for regional planning, and under that category it is found under zoning strategies. You may also be interested in using the Nature Conservancy Resilient River Explorer, which is an excellent web-based tool for evaluating the opportunities and challenges of creating riparian buffer zones based on the level of impervious cover and urbanization that exists in any given catchment basin. Thanks for attending this training session and learning about how zoning commissions can actively protect riparian buffers and riparian corridors in your town.